Hello everyone, this is Sarah's Trivia, and today we're continuing the late scholar Lu Meng Let's Talk Lore series with episode 4, titled The Legacy of Zhou Yu. Now, last time we ended as Lu Meng flexed his strategic mind while serving under Zhou Yu against Cao Ren's forces in the Jin province, and we picked things up with Cao Ren's army on the back foot following a failed counterattack against Guaning's incursion at Yiling that resulted in the loss of roughly a quarter of his army. And with this loss, Cao Ren was helpless in stopping Zhou Yu's crossing of the Yangtze River and the subsequent siege on the city of Jiangling itself. In response to Zhou Yu's assault, Cao Ren rounded up 300 of his best troops and handed the command of this elite group over to his personal retinue captain, Niu Jin, in hopes that Niu Jin can sally out with this force and deal a morale-crushing blow to Zhou Yu's vanguard army before a complete siege of the city could be formed. But with thousands of troops just within Zhou Yu's vanguard alone, Niu Jin and his 300 men soon found themselves surrounded and trapped deep behind enemy lines. Observing this development atop of the city wall, Cao Ren's chief secretary, Chen Jiao, and many of Cao Ren's officers could do little aside from expressing their despair. Cao Ren, on the other hand, quickly requested for his armor and horse as he would climb down the city wall, round up a few dozen riders from his personal retinue, as he motioned to leave the city to rescue Niu Jin. Fearing that Cao Ren was throwing his life away, Chen Jiao quickly rushed to Cao Ren's side, pulling on the reins of Cao Ren's horse as hard as he could in order to prevent Cao Ren from leaving the safety of the city. Trying his best to persuade Cao Ren, Chen Jiao argued that Cao Ren's life and the safety of the city was worth far more than the lives of Niu Jin and the 300 troops outside. Paying no attention to Chen Jiao, Cao Ren brushed him aside, put on his armor, and rode out of the city with his few dozen retinue. Now knowing that he could do nothing to stop Cao Ren at this point, Chen Jiao quickly raced back up the city wall to track Cao Ren's progress as he ordered the troops to make preparations for a sally-out rescue mission should Cao Ren come under any danger. Initially, Chen Jiao breathed a sigh of relief when he saw Cao Ren and his riders stop their horses at the outer moat of the city, roughly 100 paces from Zhou Yu's vanguard forces. At this point, Chen Jiao prayed that Cao Ren was just going to project enough of a threat to scare Zhou Yu's vanguard forces into leaving a tiny opening for Niu Jin's troops to pull back. But Chen Jiao's prayers would not be answered, as after a brief pause, Cao Ren and his few dozen riders leap across the narrow dry moat designed to stop siege weapons and charge head-on into Zhou Yu's vanguard forces. Right away, Niu Jin and most of his troops managed to break out of the encirclement that was now shattered by Cao Ren's initial charge. However, after Cao Ren and his cavalry rounded back to the moat after the first charge, it was evident that there were still many small detachments of Niu Jin's initial 300 men still trapped within Zhou Yu's forces. So without any hesitation, Cao Ren ordered another charge, and another, as Zhou Yu's vanguard forces soon started to lose their will to fight, as more and more of their troops fell to Cao Ren and his cavalry. In the end, Cao Ren and what remained of Niu Jin's troops safely retreated back to Jiangling, as the worry-sick chief secretary Chen Jiao welcomed them back to the city while heaping praises onto General Cao Ren, comparing him to a general from the heavens for his display of bravery. And when Cao Cao eventually heard about Cao Ren's feat here, Cao Ren was rewarded with the second marquis title of Anping Tinghou. But despite Cao Ren's heroics and a later reinforcement from Xu Huang, the situation at Jiangling still favored Zhou Yu, as the balance of power tipped steadily towards Zhou Yu as the casualties continued to climb for Cao Ren and the defenders at Jiangling. Close to a year into the siege, Cao Ren finally had an opening to turn the tide of battle when Zhou Yu took a stray arrow into the side of his ribcage, seriously injuring him to the point that Zhou Yu was unable to get out of bed to command the troops. Hearing this, Cao Ren rallied his army in hopes of one final showdown against Zhou Yu's forces while he was incapacitated. But when Cao Ren's forces arrived outside of Zhou Yu's encampment, Zhou Yu mustered up all his strength and propped himself in front of his troops to rally their morale and dampen Cao Ren's, as Cao Ren and his troops suddenly felt like the injury was a ploy and a trap that they had now fallen into. Losing their will to fight, Cao Ren hastily ordered a retreat, only to take more losses against Zhou Yu's pursuit that would ultimately doom the defense for good. Now, of course, this arrow wound would eventually claim Zhou Yu's life, but not before Cao Ren would finally call it quits in late 209, as he and his army would officially abandon the Nan commandery as they would retreat farther inland to the city of Xiangyang. As for Zhou Yu, for their success in taking the Nan commandery, Sun Quan would promote Zhou Yu as the new administrator, while Lu Meng would also receive a promotion to become a lieutenant general and the mayor of Xunyang County. Now, in the aftermath of this campaign, one factor that is often overlooked when evaluating Lu Meng's eventual military outlook is the time he spent serving under Zhou Yu here. Because right after Zhou Yu's successful capture of the Nan commandery, the grand strategy laid out by Zhou Yu for Sun Quan was the conquest of Liuzhang in the Yi province, the annexation of Zhanglu in Hanzhong, and an alliance with Ma Chao in the Liang province to form this western front against Cao Cao before resuming their attack on Cao Ren's position in Xiangyang. In a sense, Zhou Yu's vision was almost a mirror image of the grand strategy laid out for Liu Bei by Zhuge Liang, as both believed that a two-front attack from the Liang province and the Jin province would be key to defeating Cao Cao. So it is not surprising to see how even after the rise of Liu Bei and Sun Quan's fixation on Hefei, that Lu Meng would continue to push for the conquest of the Jin province held by Guan Yu, as in his mind, this was always part of the grand strategy laid out by his commander Zhou Yu, who would die soon after in early 210, just as he was preparing the army for invasion of the Yi province. Yet with Zhou Yu's death, the invasion of the Yi province would be called off by Sun Quan, especially as Zhou Yu's replacement in Lu Su favored maintaining the current alliance with Liu Bei, who had also become in-laws with Sun Quan during this period, with his marriage to Sun Quan's younger sister, Lady Sun. Now, speaking of Zhou Yu's replacement Lu Su, we have to talk about how Lu Meng earned his moniker as the Late Scholar. From our story so far, we have established that Lu Meng came from a relatively poor family who moved around quite a bit during his youth due to the upheaval during the later periods of the Eastern Han Dynasty, and in his teenage years, Lu Meng spent most of his time hanging out in his brother-in-law Deng Dang's army camp. So it's safe to assume that Lu Meng never got a formal education. But from stories of how Lu Meng was able to quote the famed Han ambassador Ban Chao, it is also safe to assume that Lu Meng was at least literate, but far from a scholar, and for the most part, he carried this reputation as an uneducated army brat with him. So when Sun Quan eventually promoted him after his early military reorganization, Sun Quan famously approached both Lu Meng and Jiang Qin to instruct them on the importance of being educated, as he recommended both of them to take daily studies and read classics. Initially, Lu Meng resisted this and complained that he was far too busy with military matters to study and read daily. But Sun Quan cut Lu Meng off and told Lu Meng that he had no disillusions of turning Lu Meng into a Confucian scholar capable of writing commentaries on classical works, but rather he just wanted Lu Meng to become somewhat familiar with the classics and maybe take some inspiration from events of the past and apply them to suitable situations. And if you're going to complain about being too busy, you can't possibly be busier than me. And I still read every day and feel that I benefit greatly from doing so. And from that point on, Lu Meng took Sun Quan's advice to heart, as he tried his best to study and read a little each and every day, and over the years, Lu Meng eventually turned himself into quite the scholar, and thus the moniker of Late Scholar. Now, this slow accumulation of knowledge by Lu Meng was not publicly known, especially by those not around him. And it would take until after Zhou Yu's death, when Lu Su was traveling to replace Zhou Yu at Lukou, that Lu Su was stopped by Lu Meng's encampment for a brief rest to discover Lu Meng's transformation. Now, Lu Su and Lu Meng were not familiar with each other, as they had only crossed paths briefly during Sun Ce's conquest of the south. So in Lu Su's mind, Lu Meng was still that uneducated, young, and reckless army brat, while Lu Su's background was a wealthy, land-owning gentry who grew up with a proper Confucian education. So initially, when Lu Su was visiting Lu Meng, Lu Su was actually contemplating reassigning Lu Meng away from his current frontline role on the borders with Guan Yu. But after sharing a deep conversation during drinks, discussing their current position against Guan Yu and Lu Meng's outlook on the future of the Sun-Liu alliance, Lu Su became deeply impressed by Lu Meng's analysis of the situation and his ability to cite historical examples to support his arguments. Delighted by the late scholar that Lu Meng had become, Lu Su quickly got up, walked over to Lu Meng, and patted him lovingly on his back as he exclaimed how impressed he was with Lu Meng's transformation, and Lu Meng would respond with the famous line, 士别三日，即跟刮目相待, which is still a famous idiom used today that translates to meaning that gentlemen who part ways for even 3 days will undergo change, and that one cannot judge another by their assessment from the past. And thus the late scholar Lu Meng was born, and a close friendship between Lu Su and Lu Meng was formed that would eventually give way to Lu Meng succeeding Lu Su as the leader of Sun Quan's Western Front upon Lu Su's death. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here, as our episode will come to an end. Next time when we return, we'll continue our series by looking at some of Lu Meng's military exploits during this time serving under Lu Su, as wars between the eventual three kingdoms will start to heat up in the years between 213 and 217. So hopefully y'all have enjoyed this episode enough to consider subscribing to the channel for more content on Three Kingdoms history, or simply support the channel by leaving a comment below, or just by hitting the like button. And as always, I'll see you all next time. Bye!